three things are, first of all, we have what's called the mind, right? And the mind is, in a certain sense, what makes a human being different to an animal. Now, it's not that animals don't have minds. In fact, animals can be smarter than people. For example, bees can actually calculate distances to flowers better than supercomputers can. Now, we're not talking about better than a calculator. We're talking about better than the fastest calculator in the universe. That's how smart they are. Not only that, we know they come back and you know a little bit about bees. They come back and they do a little dance and they communicate, not verbally, but they communicate through the way they dance and this and that and how many times they spin around where that flower is. So it's not like this guy has a small brain. He's able to calculate the distance because he has to report the distance back. And he's reporting based on where the sun is. It's a very, very, very sophisticated calculation that's going on in this tiny, tiny, tiny little bee brain. So it shows us that maybe size doesn't really matter. It's the gift that God has given you. In fact, I remember this thing that this professor had hooked up. He had an ape, and the ape was playing with a joystick, a little game. And it turns out that this ape, going through a maze with the joystick, is actually, he says, a genius. Like the guy knows like mathematical abilities perhaps better than most people. However, there's one however. They don't have a mind that thinks. Their mind is like a computer. You can't say my computer exists. You can't say my computer is conscious. My computer has a desire. Why? My computer, in certain respects, is smarter than me. It does math better than me. It remembers better than me. But one thing it doesn't do is it doesn't think. It doesn't choose. It doesn't know what's going on. It's just a rock. It's just a rock that's shaped in a way to think. That's all it is. And so also the animal, in a certain sense, has a desire. The desire is, as we'll discuss, the main desires is pain and pleasure. And so the bottom line is that it's just the desire motivates its thought process. So yeah. Well, I do have some people that listen online, so we can't like go too far off tangent. But if it's a specific question on the specific topic, then it for sure. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah. Right. 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 Okay. So very briefly, the question was, what about animals learning? So the answer, oh, Rab Misha, Shalom Aleichem. So animals don't really learn that much. We see that animals have not built cities or buildings. If they were actually quite smart, they would change their behavior once in a while. So we don't find a lot of. I mean, obviously you get a little bit of upgrade, but very, very, very minor. Um, yeah. So we're discussing the three things that we have in people. We have um, the notion of the mind, and the mind is where we think, and it's different. Even though an animal might have a mind, which is sometimes smarter than a human, but the mind is always a subject to the emotions, the desire. So Hashem made this thing. Let's say He made the bee want pollen. So that's it. He might be a genius in how to find it, but that's it. That's all he does. The queen bee's got to lay. Everybody's just doing what their instincts or biological instincts are telling them to do. That's number one. So what makes a human unique is that we can think outside of ourselves. Right? That's what makes us unique. I have a friend, Oliver Shalom, Norman Frank. He said a very good line. He said, "Why was a man created in the Garden of Eden?" He said, "To be a man, you have to live in the Garden of Eden. In other words, to think, you actually have to not be too stressed. When you're too stressed, we almost go into an animal stage, which is like, okay, what do I do to protect myself? Or if a person is too addicted, the emotion is too strong, how do I get this thing, right? So part of what society hopefully does for us, and really the only reason governments exist, is to protect us so we can be safe. And then hopefully we reach a point where, okay, we're not panicking, so now we can actually think, okay, what matters, what doesn't matter, what should I be doing, what shouldn't I be doing. So this is one important thing. The second thing that rules us or has a very powerful influence, and the interesting thing about the mind, the only, if you want to call it, mammal that has a prefrontal lobe, that's where our independent thinking is, am I correct? Prefrontal lobe. The only mammal that has that is a human being, even though an ape may be a genius or a bee might be so smart, but they don't have an independent mind which is thinking independent of the way they're feeling. They can't separate the two. And what's very, very interesting, if you know a little bit about the brain, so we have the amygdala nuclei region. So when you have an emotion, certainly let's say an emotion like fear, what happens is the amygdala will take over, and that's why unfortunately people get into trauma, because something switched on the fear, and now they're not really thinking with their prefrontal lobes. Your entire brain system can bypass the prefrontal lobe. And so what you're really doing is you're kind of surviving in a way. And so it's interesting because if you look at brain scans, unfortunately, of people that have been through whatever, let's say, I don't remember exactly what it was, but I'm just saying stress or things like that over prolonged periods. The prefrontal lobes, because everything in the brain, by the way, the most important thing for the brain is what? Oxygen. And how does it get oxygen? Through blood. That's why exercise is so important for the brain, because the brain is made up of cells, and the cells live with oxygen. Obviously, it has a little bit of food and this and that. The top level of your food and everything, they call it what is called a brain-body barrier. It's a very powerful barrier between that doesn't let in anything. That's why actually COVID, which was designed by our good friends in China, no, it wasn't. And so, right, I mean, I have a friend that's very close with, as I said, it's a public forum, but he was very close with a certain intelligence agency. Right away, he told me that the COVID had strands of of a certain virus. So it was put together. It was like, if you looked at it, it was a put together disease. But in any event, it was very well put together as well. So one of the things that it did, as we know, one of the symptoms was people lost their smell and taste. And now, where do you smell and taste? In the brain. In the brain. Yes, through Hashem, correct, but also in the brain. And so therefore, it meant that it was actually getting into the brain. So it had an ability to bypass the brain barrier, which is a very, 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 very protected place. In any event, the story is, and I can say for myself, I don't know if it was COVID or the vaccine or something, but I can see that I don't, because I'm very, very aware of my own thinking. It's kind of the only thing I'm aware of. So I can see that my thoughts are not as sharp as they were before. So there was something, anyway, in any event. I think I find with like when I was taking like citric acid, which is like very strong vitamin C, that I felt clearer again. But in any event, so it's an interesting thing. I think vitamin C does make a difference.
So what you're saying is we have to take measures to declutter anything around that brain area, right?
Well, the most important thing for the brain, and there are now studies, unfortunately people get older and they get various brain disease. The most important thing is actually exercise, because it's all about blood flow. Because the more blood that gets to your brain, the more oxygen that gets to your brain. The more oxygen that gets to your brain, the more literally your brain cells live. After 40 years old, hi everybody, if you're able to put on mute, would be great. After 40 years old, every 10 years, the brain loses 5% of its mass. That means 50 years, that means, let's say a person's 90, they've lost 5, 10, 20, 25, 30% of its mass. Am I correct? I think so.
You said 5% for
No, 5% every decade after 40 years old, right? So before 40, it's like same mass, all the things. So you're literally losing cells. But the thing is that if if you're exercising, you're giving blood. First of all, regeneration actually, interestingly enough, comes from thinking, learning new things. So it's very important. People that are sitting in front of the TV, it's a danger. But if you're learning new things and also you're exercising and also eating healthy, also not, these are very important. The reason, just one second, the reason it's important is because basically you're feeding the brain cells. So if you just think about the brain in a very, very simple way, like a sponge, but the sponge is alive. And so the more, or even like your plant, the more you feed it, the more you water it, the better it's going to live, the more it's going to have cells. So we just have to be very careful to do these things. And also stress is not helpful. Yes. First of all, it's so interesting what you're saying about being in the amygdala state. I feel like I always feel like I can kind of like feel just like a muscle's working. Yeah. I can feel really where my brain energy is going to, and I feel like, wow, like that opened up a whole channel to like realize I haven't been in the right prefrontal, I've really been in the, wow. In the old, wow. In the yeah, sure, sure. Of the brain a lot. Mm-hmm. And then my question is, if exercising the brain is so important, is it important then therefore to like exercise different parts of your brain, to exercise your prefrontal cortex to make it right stronger? Right. So I don't know. I don't know if you have an ability to move blood around. I definitely move some to the prefrontal. Or like to do certain things that are known to work your prefrontal. Oh, right, like math and stuff like that. Huh? Third eye meditation. Right, right. We have a third eye meditation. Right. Yeah, so there's no question about it. Yeah, I find that if I want to get a little sharper or use certain parts of my brain, I can, if I just do math, it will make a difference. Because like you have your right brain, which is kind of creative, and then you have your left brain, which is more logical. But sometimes you have to like wake it up. You wake up the logic. So if you do math problems, it should help. Certainly, I don't know, but I'm sure there are a lot of studies on doing word puzzles and stuff like that. I don't want to take too much time, but maybe later Moshe could tell you about third eye meditation, what that is. So the point is, obviously, if you're davening and you're thinking, a very important thing for the brain is there's a classic thing with the body, which is use it or lose it, right? That's the way the body works. The same thing is, unfortunately, today, it's very possible to live a life without thinking. So just thinking is very, very good. Now, what happens when a person stresses, they're not really thinking. They're like kind of just, prepared to deal with reality. So there's no question that putting your thought process, that Baal Shem Tov speaks a lot about it, kind of calls it the open state and the closed state. So when a person is in anxiety, what you'll notice is your thinking becomes much more focused and narrow. In fact, there are drugs that mimic the chemicals that we take that are produced when we have anxiety, literally to help people with heart conditions, because it kind of constricts, I think, various parts. And so the bottom line is that I recently saw this. Wow, very, very powerful idea. Amazing. I think this was in the Ramak, Tomer Dvorah. Amazing. I'm going through the Ramak. It's very beautiful. So he says like this. So a person's angry, right? So if you think about a person that's angry, that Baal Shem Tov calls anger negative fear. So if a person really wasn't afraid, I don't know, there's a mosquito and it's about to bite me. So I get upset. I'm angry. But what if that wasn't a mosquito? What if I know that mosquito can't bite? I'm like, I don't care. So you see, there's a connection between fear and anger. Very interestingly, I should tell you, Baal Shem Tov tells us how to overcome anger. And that is through, he says, the way that you overcome anger is through joy and love. Because everything in the emotions are a balance. So, for example, how do you get rid of a salty taste in a soup? Add sugar. Can't take out the salt, but you can add sugar. How do you get rid of a salty taste in me? You got to add some sugar. So that's why an infinitely better therapy than telling people that their father wasn't so good is actually just love them. Wow. If you give somebody love, and if somebody, sometimes Baal Shem Tov says, just dance, you want to be happy, just dance. If you do that, then what will happen is this person will just feel good. It's very simple. That's what we say, simcha pirates together, that joy breaks boundaries. In other words, you got stuck, you got constricted in this place. And usually, I think most of the things that are the issues to people, and you can confirm or deny, please, is actually fear of criticism. How do you feel about that statement? Fear of criticism. The most of the things that people fear. Yeah, makes sense. Criticism, to be shamed or to be mocked. In other words, a lot of it's emotional fear. Fear is fear. So if I'm afraid of, God forbid, I don't know, a person had a traumatic event or afraid of a bullet is one thing. But actually, I think that most people, their trauma and the state of anxiety that they're in is fear of criticism, which is interesting because the Torah tells us, in the very beginning, Shavisi Hashem Lenegdi Tamid, that don't be afraid of what people say. It doesn't, like the Rebbe was very into that. It doesn't matter what people say. It matters what God says. It matters what your God, your personal God says. It matters what you think is right. It doesn't matter what people say. Yeah, totally, totally, totally. The dark side uses fear. It's a statement from the holy Kabbalist Yoda. He said the path to the dark side is fear, because really fear opens us. Fear is the opposite of love, and yeah, and it opens us up to all kinds of after fear. Because the interesting thing about fear is fear doesn't feel good, right? It can also take you away from pleasure. So then that can build resentment, that can build anger, that can build jealousy. Fear. If a person's in a state like, there's two types of fear. The Kabbalah Chassidus speaks about this. You have fear which is close and fear which is far. So fear which is close is, let's say, panic. For example, if I see a truck coming down the road and I'm afraid, but what do? I say, okay, I'm just going to get off the road. But if the truck is in front of me, I'm more than afraid. Every single part of my body shuts down. That's panic. Literally, you have a system, survival mode. You shut down rational thinking. That's the amygdala. Literally takes away blood from your prefrontal lobe. It will increase your heart rate. It will decrease digestion. It sends blood to the muscles so you could fight or flight. So what are you doing now? You are in a position to survive, right? Which is good if there's a truck facing you. But if there isn't a truck facing you and the only thing you're afraid of, there's a very special psychiatrist. Are you familiar with Kleinian psychology? Melanie Klein? Yeah. You're a fan of her? Yes, very special, right? So the Kleinian psychologist, I don't know if you know, but there was a disciple of Freud, a Jewish woman, a very bright woman, Melanie Klein. Melanie Klein, her whole philosophy was, correct me if I'm wrong, her whole philosophy is that our issue in life is jealousy. And the antidote to jealousy is gratitude. And so there's a Lubavitcher. He became a Lubavitcher. He became a Baal Tshuva, and he's written many books, wonderful books. The Tyranny of Malice, I Hate You, You Hate Me, interesting things. But really, if you think about it, he gives an example. I read this book, Tyranny of Malice. So this lady, anyway, I don't want to go because I don't want to go down that path because it's not so beautiful. But the bottom line is that he actually created, he was a psychiatrist, he is a psychiatrist, hopefully he's still alive. He created like, if you want to call it, a hospital for psychiatric people. And basically his whole theory was like love. That's it, just love people. And he healed people. He healed people through this way. He actually had the psychiatrist or the therapist live. It was like a house, big house, live inside the place. It was called Arbor House. And one of the people he healed, there was like a movie made about this lady. And she said, I saw the interview where she said that her anxiety had come from, I guess, fear of her mother. Now that can actually happen, where a person can be unfortunately criticized too harshly, and that creates a panic. Remember, fear is not so bad, but panic is what can really hurt us badly, because you're living in the state of panic. Now, in fact, the Japanese have a unique social. They say the Japanese are not born, they are created, right? I know somebody that she spent some time in Japan, bright Jewish woman. So they have a whole system of like who's higher and who's lower, and they bow. Like, so if the guy's a CEO, you bow this much, and if he's a manager, this much. It's like this is not something that a normal person is born with, but they're educated in their whole system. It's a whole crazy system. But programmed. They're programmed. Absolutely, they're programmed. And furthermore, um, they have a social anxiety because, of course, I don't know what the repercussions are, but when you program people, you usually use negative stimulus. So, and there are communities even within the religious world that may be harsh or too harsh based on the background, this and that, and it's not healthy. It's not healthy. Like what's unique about, I think, Chabad Hasidus, at least what I've seen. I don't know other Hasidus. I hope they're also similar. But you see, a person can do really one of three things. You can say, okay, everyone do whatever they want, which is not healthy. The other thing is you say, no, this is what you have to do, and this is you have to do it. There are no options, and many societies do that, and there's a certain logic to that. I know a Jew that came from Iran to my hometown, Kansas City, and he's appalled by what goes on in America. He's like, yeah, the Muslims, and they have they have laws and this and that, and there's a certain truth to that. Like, what, are you gonna let everyone just do whatever they want? But of course, that can also be a little harsh and not necessarily really good. But there's the author, his name is Joseph Burka, of that book, The Tyranny of Malice. Yeah. So he says, so it's not, he says, so the bottom line is there's a third way. The third way is basically to recognize we all have a godly soul. We all want to do good, but we also have an animal soul. We also have a part of us that's wild. Then we have a Yetzer Hara. And so it says it's the job basically of those who know to teach those who don't know. And you have to encourage, etc., etc. So that's really our role in this world, particularly the people that know. It's the whole idea of Chabad, right? You can just hang out. My grandfather met the Satmar Rebbe once in Miami. So he said to him, why don't you send out your shluchim to the whole world, or your students, to encourage Jews? So he said, man shitta is, my opinion is, and Satmar Rebbe was no slouch. He, in his own right, he was a very great man. But he said, my opinion is when a house is burning, you don't save the furniture. In other words, he was saying, I gotta save, I gotta save my people. And yeah, it was after the Holocaust, yeah. And so my grandfather said to him, are you calling Jewish souls furniture? And so, right, so that's the point, that the Rebbe looked at every single Jew and he noticed in them God. And so therefore, he was very, very good at, and we've discussed this before, he was very good at the idea that it's your job to teach the person that doesn't know. You don't blame somebody for not knowing. It's your job to bring the Torah and the mitzvahs to them. And it's very beautiful because when you have that mentality, because a lot of what people deal with is the fact, okay, let's say my structure or my group is right, but how do you deal with the fact that other people are wrong? So Islam, some people in Islam say, well, it's very simple. You just chop off the head. Other people will say, no, you have to, like Christianity, well, you have to convert them, right? But in Judaism, we'll say, well, you have to educate them, right? So it's not your job to put them down, but to bring them up, right? That's the key here. So let's get back to the subject at hand. So first of all, we're talking about the idea that we have a mind. And the mind is independent, which is an amazing thing, because we're the only creation. Now, I also wanted to mention this thing with the Baal Shem Tov and the Ramaka was saying that, right, to open and close. Thank you. So the Ramak says like this. So a person, let's say, is upset. So what does that mean? So in fear, what happens is you look at something and the thing seems very big to you, right? In other words, and you're a child psychiatrist, so you know this, a child can unfortunately have anxiety from something very small. But to them, it's very, very big. And actually, Freud speaks about this. He says that you can't condemn somebody. If somebody says, wow, this is so hard. Whether he's under a ton of bricks or he's under a paper clip, to him, it's very hard. So you can't say, oh, what are you complaining about? But the answer is that to him, it's fearful. And the fear basically feels the same, however you cut it. So the Ramak says like this, you have to take the person to a higher perspective. And so that's a lot of what Judaism does. And I get people and they're like, wow, you really make me happy, this and that. I'm thinking, what did I do? I didn't do much. But the thing is, at least I'm saying that Mashiach is coming. Right? The Rebbe actually says this. The reason he's so into Mashiach is for happiness. Because let's say if you don't believe that Mashiach is coming, I'm sure in your work you've seen this, especially today, so many people have, the studies show that the media creates anxiety and depression. So if all you see is what's going wrong, and even children, they have studies with children, that children being taught about how, basically, if you go to school, public school, what are you being taught as a child? Never mind all the bad things, but the world itself is coming to an end, right? And you're a child, you believe. So if they give children projects like, okay, we're going to go clean up the gardens or something, okay, they're like, makes them feel, because now you've given them hope, right? So having a broader perspective on life, which is, and we'll discuss this soon, but or maybe we'll take a break and discuss it now, which is really the ultimate perspective of life is really what the Rebbe teaches us. And that is that we're all partners in creation. And that was the mistake of Adam HaRishon. Adam HaRishon made a mistake. What was his mistake? His mistake was he thought the world was created for him. I shouldn't even say that. That's not correct. Adam HaRishon realized his own greatness. That's why he says Adam with a big aleph. Adam was a very, very, very great. He was greater than the angels. All the souls that will exist come from Adam HaRishon. We're all like, everything is just an offshoot of Adam HaRishon. But the problem was he knew it. And so when you feel your own greatness, in fact, it says that he looked into Mother Eclipus. What was the Chet Tzadas? He looked into so there are different realms. He looked at the realm of evil, which is arrogance. So when he looked in, and because he's a human, he was sensitive, he was like naive, and he didn't understand what he was looking at. He's just like us children. When we were children, we looked up at the big people. They seem big, so you desire it. Then that desire kind of became part of him, which is part of what we're doing. We're reversing that. So because he felt great, or maybe greater, he lost touch with reality. Because it says, it's very interesting, if you notice in Pirkei Avos, many times it says, this takes a person, it takes a person out of reality. So, for example, famous things, it says, Akino, Ataiva Vakava, jealousy. So if a person's jealous of someone else, they'll do things that they would never do. Now, why did you do it? Let's say they'll make fun of them. All the evil in the world basically is jealousy. And this is the book, The Tyranny of Malice, where people have done really terrible things. Just an example, there were 3 women, they were called spinsters, that they had never got married, and one of the sisters got married. And once when the sister that got married, and I was so happy she visited her 2 sisters, they locked her up in a closet. The poor woman, I think she was locked in a closet for 10 years. Something like that. In other words, but why did they do that? It was bringing out, that's the power of jealousy, right? So anyway, so jealousy, so it makes it, now it says their sister, and it's not to say they didn't love their sister. They cared for her, they fed her for 10 years, but they got jealous of her happiness, right? So jealousy takes a person out of reality. But there are many things. I'd like to make a book. If we have any, one day we'll get some sponsorship for this. But everything that, just in Pirkei Avos itself, it says at least 10 things that take a person out of reality. So we know the most famous is Akina, jealousy, Hataiva, desire. I worked in a town where there were a lot of rehabs. I could tell you, and Rabbi Twersky says this as well, that people that are addicts are some of the sweetest, nicest people that you'll ever meet. But they have an addiction. And they'll do stupid things to get that addiction. So we're not going into the whole psychology behind it, but the bottom line is that's the truth. So, and we all have addictions. I remember listening to a lecture from a doctor. His first statement of the lecture was, I am a sugar addict. And so are you. Right? That's it. Sugar is addictive. It's just that simple. It rewards you for very little effort. Great stuff. That would make a lot of sense. Right, she's living in West Rogers Park. What do you expect? So, yeah, different. In any event, the point is that the desire will overtake. So if you ask me, and I mess up every single day. Like if every time after I have sugary chocolate, I'm like, that's it. No more sugary chocolate. Salty chocolate would be great. That's a good idea. Yeah. Right, right. Yeah, well, we'll discuss these things later. But the thing is, we literally go back to the same thing again. So your brain knows this is a really stupid thing to do. Yeah, yeah, sure. If it gets too cold for anyone, let me know. But your emotions, is that okay? Let me know. Yeah, yeah. So your emotions say, okay, I like it. So it takes you out of reality, right? So reality would be your brain, what makes sense. But the emotion, it doesn't care about what makes sense. Emotion is, this is what I feel, both for the good or the bad, meaning I want it, or both for pleasure or for pain. Meaning, in even to your, right, right. So it makes sense in terms of even for yourself. So the emotions will do things that are not even basically long-term thinking versus short-term thinking. Like a simple example is it makes sense, let's say, to study for a job. Nobody likes studying. But the person that has self-discipline or something can discipline themselves. The person that doesn't, emotion takes over. I saw this great talk by this guy. So he said, I've got the scientific description of my brain, and this is like my brain scan, and this is how I work. When there's no pressure, you see a nice beach and a pina colada, and when there's pressure, you see a monkey going like, ah. So he's saying that, how do I work? Well, when I panic, I work. Right. My daughter's first word was Monkeyland. This place in South Africa. Yeah, this place in South Africa. They took these monkeys that people owned, and they kind of released it. Not released. They had this massive location where all these monkeys going around. Yeah, like a monkey sanctuary. In any event, okay. So let's focus. The first thing that we have to know is like this. We have a brain, and what's unique about the brain is it can think. But, and this is kind of what you discussed, when you say good and bad, and it's important because I'm going to give descriptions that are very, very valuable, because if you remember the descriptions, you'll be able to understand this concept, which really kind of includes almost everything. Good and bad has two definitions. The definition of good and bad. Definition number one is absolute good and bad, and definition number two is personal good and bad. So absolute good and bad is Hashem's good and bad. What does Hashem say is good, and what does Hashem say is bad? From Hashem's perspective, and that's why we have the Torah and we have a Rebbe, Hashem's perspective is I have to listen to Hashem. The Alter Rebbe says it's in Tanya. The only holiness that exists is basically obedience to God. So if I listen to Hashem, and what does Hashem tell us? Basically, Torah mitzvahs, goodness and kindness, but also a very, very important thing we mentioned many times. It's important to realize that you are part of a bigger picture. So, in other words, don't think. I just want to see if it's going to be warmer over there. You look like you're a little. Yeah. Are you? Are you okay there? Okay. So, so I'm saying like this. So there's two definitions of two definitions of good and bad. Right. Definition number one is listening to Hashem. Now I'll get to the other one in a second. Definition number one is listening to Hashem. Now, what does that mean? Listening to Hashem is not only the idea, oh, there's Torah, mitzvahs, da, da, da. It's also understanding the bigger picture. In other words, what is good and bad according to Hashem? So according to Hashem, and we mentioned this, so we did kind of a whole class on this. According to, yes, but there's a certain context. What's the context? The context is that Hashem made us because He loves us and He wants us to grow. And so the context is you're part of a picture. In other words, you have to be kind to one another. You have a special role in this world. There's a community. If you look at the Torah always speaks about this idea of Am Yisrael, the people of Israel. Right? So other religions, in a certain sense, it doesn't matter the community. Because there's a God, let's say Christianity basically says, there's a God. If you do this, you go to heaven. If not, you go to hell. The idea of the community, the peoplehood, doesn't really matter. Right? Um, but in Judaism, that's not the case. It's much more like we are a people. Every Jew is responsible, and certainly humanity as a whole. Hello, how are you? Oh, welcome, welcome. Wow. If you want, you can join a class. We're doing a class now. We're speaking about the secrets of life. Okay. Good to see you. Good to see you. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So the idea is that, okay, so from Hashem's perspective, we are the whole universe in a way is a family, right? Hashem is like the father, mother, and we have, or let's use Hashem as the father, and we all have, particularly people, we're the chosen of Hashem, particularly the Jewish people, we have a roles to play. Whether you're, as the Arizal says, there are two main types of souls, masters of Torah, masters of good deeds. Whether you're male, whether you're female, whatever, you have roles. Certainly help other people in your community, and certainly as a Jew, you have responsibility to the Gentiles to teach them the seven Noahide laws, Hasidus, teach them so they can develop, they can grow. So really, you're looking at the world from God's perspective. Sure, we're affected by everybody. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, very good point. Everybody steps into their power, then the whole world becomes Mashiach, basically. Yeah. So this is a very, very important idea. And okay, so this idea number one, that's good and bad according to God, right? And bad would be to ignore Hashem or ignore your responsibilities. So that's the notion of good and bad from a higher perspective. But then you have good and bad. I guess you could call it just classical good and bad, which is literally good and bad, towards other humans. But you also have good and bad for yourself in a selfish way. Now, what does that mean, good and bad? And it's not a bad thing. It just means it's good for me, let's say, to go to work to earn money, right? So my body, my laziness will say, no, I don't want to work. Why should I work? But that's not good for you. So there's good and bad just for yourself, which also is a true definition of good and bad. Right, so that's an interesting question. So what about stealing? So stealing, you might say, well, that's good for me, but actually that's where your first good and bad has to take over. The good and bad of God and the good and bad of society. And then the good and bad that you do for yourself has to be under those three. You can't contradict those other two. Right. 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 So yeah. Yeah, that's true. So there's good and bad on three levels. There's good and bad from being part of Hashem's story. You are chosen by Hashem for a specific role, and you're here in the world for at least 70, 80, 90 years. Then you've got a mission, etc. Then there's good and bad, basically, at least towards other people. Right, correct. Mashiach's eternity. And then, yeah, well said. And then you got good and bad, just simple common sense. Right now, the body does not have common sense because, like we said before, the body just wants sugar. Okay, let me answer this question. Then let's save the questions for later, because but basically, the question is that Adam and Rishon, what's the difference between good and bad? Then the answer is very simple. That before Eitz Hadas, the good and bad didn't really, the selfishness didn't exist. Everything, they were basically in an intimate position, but they only thought about Hashem. Everything that they did was coming from their godly soul. So it was only when the animal soul, basically when they ate from that fruit, the animal soul was born. There was only a godly soul. So now, right, exactly. Now it's also now it's about me. Yes, now it's how does this affect me? What do I want? And that's why the that's why it says it will open up your eyes to know good and bad, and literally to know good and bad, to see a different type of good and bad, a different reality which is separate from the ultimate good and bad. Now, of course, Hashem wanted that to happen. It says, "Noira lila b'nei Adam." Everything that happened because Hashem wanted it to happen. Why did Hashem want it to happen? Hashem wanted it to happen because He wants us to have an ego, because He wants us this to be a big harmony, a big symphony. But He wants us to grow and to choose Him to so He wants us. But this is true. Okay, okay. Let me for now. Yes, this is true. This is absolutely true. Hashem wants love. But let's talk now on the next thing. Shkach is very deep. The next thing is this: what are the emotions? So all emotions basically get included in two words, which is pain and pleasure. So pain and pleasure is meaning this thing makes me feel good. This thing makes me feel bad. So it's not so much about what is wise or stupid. That's good and bad for myself, wise or stupid. It's rather pain or pleasure. This feels in a certain way, this feels. And therefore, every single person, even if they're not a spiritual person, has a war just between their own mind, good and bad in your head, which might say, okay, go to work, and the good and bad in the heart, which was what makes me feel good, what makes me feel bad, which might say, listen, I'd rather stay home and do nothing. So you have this kind of good and bad in the emotions, what the emotions say are good. And of course, the emotions are instincts, and the instincts are what feels good at the moment and what doesn't feel good at the moment. So what makes a person healthy is if they're able to overcome the instincts. But the irony is you need the instincts. Because if you didn't get hungry and you didn't like sugar, then you wouldn't have desire. If you didn't have desire, that's depression. Then you're not going anywhere. So you have to be in a car that's moving, but you have to drive it to the right destination. That's the story. And then you have another kind of good and bad. And the other kind of good and bad is the ego. And the ego is connected to pride and shame. So to the ego, I think as somebody mentioned to me, looking good is very important. So good is how I look or how I'm perceived. And bad is basically being perceived in a negative way. And we all ultimately have an ego, which is also healthy in a way. In the Torah, we say the difference between a ganav and a gazlan is that the ganav is somebody who is, if I'm not mistaken, steals at night because he's ashamed. He doesn't want people to see. But the gazlan is the guy who's ready to steal during the day. And this is much lower because even though the first guy isn't afraid of God, but he's afraid of man at least. At least he has shame before people. A person, somebody once told me about a certain tribe that he says that's what happens when they lose shame, right? So people that are able to kind of in broad daylight steal or do something wrong, it shows that they've lost their inner pride, they've lost their own sense. And ironically, this is very, very interesting. It comes from shame. In other words, shame and pride are deeply connected. So if a person thinks that other people or that humanity thinks that they're shameful, so then they have nothing to protect. So it's when we think that others think of us in a positive way, so then, first of all, we want to look better. And second of all, we don't want to look worse. But if, God forbid, and this is what bullying is all about making the person be ashamed of themselves. And if they're ashamed of themselves, then they lack shame. Because they're ashamed of themselves, they lack shame in front of other people. Because now, in any event, people think I'm this way, so what does it matter? That's where you'll get people that will be con men. And I mean, just from a basic perspective, don't you care about what the other person thinks about you? And the answer is no. Because they already consider that people think that they're bad, so therefore they've lost their shame. And that's why, truly, if you look at how the Rebbe It is Shalom Aleichem, Reb Adam. How are you? Welcome, welcome. Oh, where are you from? Good to have you. Welcome, welcome.
What's your name?
Zevi Weinberg.
Zach.
Barak, beautiful. Okay, we're in the middle of a class, so sit down and enjoy. Yeah, no, no problem, no problem. I'm just going to continue. Welcome, welcome. Jason, are you staying with us a little?
A little? So how long?
I don't know. I'm asking. Are you staying at a center? Or are you just visiting? Oh, nice, beautiful.
Yeah.
Nice to have a friend. Okay,
Yeah, I'm in Israel for like 4 months now so far,
okay.
and
Yeah,
I'm in Scott for a week.
good. Welcome. Okay, so let's continue on what we were saying. Just to give you a little bit of an overview. We've been talking for 45 minutes straight, so I don't want to do the whole thing. But a very brief overview is we spoke about 5 levels of good and bad, right? The ultimate good and bad is good and bad based on God's definition, which is Torah mitzvahs. There's good and bad um, based on a common definition, which is kind of good and bad, kind and not cruel. There, kind of, yes. Shalom Aleichem. Then there's good and bad based on common sense, what the brain will say, hey, this is a good to eat healthy food. It's bad to eat unhealthy food. So it's good and bad for you. Um, Then you have good and bad of the heart, the instincts. The instincts say, wow, that tastes good. That's really good, right? People say, wow, that was a great steak. Now the brain might say that was a really stupid steak, but the heart says that was a great steak. So you see good and bad happens on different definitions. Your heart, your emotions are like, wow, that was great. And bad is like, wow, I missed out on that steak. That was really bad. So then you have good and bad to the pride, to the ego, if you want to call it the ego. So, wow, that made me look good, or that made me look bad. And that's a very, 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 very tricky thing. Why? Because, as we mentioned before, the ultimate good and bad, which is the good and bad from Hashem, which is what really is good and bad, which is my behavior, what I need to do in this world. That's the real definition of good and bad, can be challenged by the fake definition of good and bad, which is how do I appear to other people. Because we'll notice a beautiful story, which is that a guy told me when he became religious, suddenly everybody started to complain. He said, Saturday I used to go to the bar and then I would go to the casino. Now my wife and friends are upset that I go to shul. So I don't understand. When I went to the bar and casino, it was okay. And now it's a problem. So the idea is that a person basically doesn't want to feel less. The ego doesn't mind feeling more than anyone, doesn't mind feeling equal, but it doesn't want to feel less than anyone. So what often will happen is somebody becomes a little bit more religious, then the people, their friends will say, oh, that's not good. Mm-hmm. It's all subconscious. They're feeling, oh, wow, this person is a little bit higher than me now. But really, that's not fair. There are actually very fascinating studies with monkeys. If you give monkeys 2 cucumbers, I saw this really pretty amazing. So you got one cage over here and one cage over here, and you give a monkey a cucumber and a cucumber. So they're like, wow, that's fine. That's fair. But now what would happen if you give one monkey a cucumber, and the other monkey you give a candy? And it's the same thing to children. It will be the same reaction. And not only to children, even to adults. Imagine if you go into the bank and everybody gets, Christian bank is Xmas, everybody's getting $1,000, but not you. So the idea of fear is very, very interesting. Right. It's a very interesting thing. So because what happens is now the monkey becomes jealous and he actually takes the cucumber, he throws the cucumber away, he starts to bang on his cage. It's not fair, it's not fair. So the idea is that how do you decide what's fair? Right? As a friend of mine Norman Frankel Shalom said, life is not fair, right? You decided to be born, how you look, male, female, Jew, Gentile. I have a friend who's a very, very bright guy. So the fact that you're not a cockroach is a miracle. It's DNA. Hashem could have made you a cockroach, made you a human. So the idea is that life isn't fair. Life is a gift. Gifts aren't fair. You're lucky. You're lucky that you're alive. So once you understand that, and then if you go even deeper, this is okay, what's my mission? What's my role? One of the things that I think something good that happened to me is that I lived in Africa for many years. And so I realized, a lot of people in the West, they have guilt. Like they feel like, oh, I'm too privileged. But after I lived in Africa and I realized the extreme corruption that goes on in most of the Western, like a lot of the Western countries, they have it's a what we would call a mila, a good thing. We have a benevolent attitude, and there's a lot of charity to other countries. But if you're actually in those countries and the corruption and never mind the crime, etc., that goes on, I stop feeling guilty. It's okay. I'm not taking anything from anyone, right? And if I have, I'm very happy to share. Whatever. I'm not taking anybody's bread. In fact, the Rebbe said, some people say, oh, there's not enough food in the world, but there is enough food in the world. It's just that by the time it gets to some of these countries, the warlords will take it and they don't really distribute it very well. So that's really the problem. The problem is a problem of distribution, right? So the story is like this. How do you overcome this? Because it's very, very important. Because by nature, if you understand what I just said, if you're going to do good, you should expect to be shamed, right? I'm sure you got some of that. You became religious, right? Somebody's got a comment to say. Now, if you're not religious, no one's going to say anything. Religious people are not going to criticize you. Right now in Israel, we've got protests, right? I just saw this beautiful video. This guy basically was saying, listen, I'm not going to tell you to go to shul. You don't tell me what to do. Right? The religious are not coercing anybody to go to shul. Like to me, going to shul is very important. I'm not telling you what to eat. I'm not telling you all these things that are very, very valuable to me. You're going to tell me what to do? But where does it come from? It comes from a sense of jealousy. And therefore, it's like the jealousy creates a certain hatred. And the hatred creates a desire to push the other person down. Again, it's subconscious, but that's the way it works. And so if that's the case, should I really care about what anyone says? How can I care? Yeah. Right. Right. So what you're saying is very important. But the truth is that I shouldn't say, but the truth is that Moshe Rabbeinu was shown the entire future. And he was most impressed from our generation. Why? I think there were generations before us that were quite amazing. We have right here in Sfas, Chana and her 7 sons. Our ancestors were probably bigger tzaddikim than us. I don't know about you, but definitely of me. They were bigger tzaddikim. But there's something that we have in our generation that in a way is unique to our generation. And Moshe Rabbeinu was most impressed from the Jews of our generation. Why? In fact, one of the reasons he was so humble was he looked at the Jews of our generation. What was so great? This generation.
I was going to say, what do you mean by our generation?
Yeah, he was shown the future by God. God showed him all the future generations. Yeah.
Which generation? Y, X, Z?
I don't know, maybe the last 70 years or so. You'll understand what I'm saying in a second.
Okay.
What is unique to our generation is the Baal Tshuva. And what is so special about the Baal Tshuva? That the Baal Tshuva has to overcome shame. Now, studies show that people are more afraid of public speaking than of death. Now, death is a pretty big thing to be afraid of. A lot of people are worried about it. They'll do a lot not to die. And yet they're more afraid to speak in public. Now, what's the worst thing that can happen if you speak in public? Shame.
You'll be embarrassed.
But the point is that shame is a very big. It's probably our biggest fear. Right? Our biggest fear is to be shamed. And so, therefore, the idea that a person is willing to overcome, look at women that dress sneas, it's a big thing. No, why do, by nature, if I can say, I'm not a woman, so, but I'll just say it. I think by nature, it's in the nature of a woman to really be modest and dress sneas. We have a famous thing that Shlomo HaMelech was challenged by the Queen of Sheba. Well, everybody heard that Shlomo HaMelech was so smart. So she had different riddles and stuff like that. So one of her riddles, she dressed 1,000 children exactly the same. So which one are men and which one are women? So he gave them all nuts. So the boys, they went and they all grabbed the nuts. The women, they were like, they scooped them up, they put them. So the point is there's certain innate, I remember with my own children, we had a jungle gym. It was kind of like a story high. And once my 2-year-old son is on the jungle gym, and I look at him, he's like about to jump off. I'm like, Eliezer, what are you doing? He says, I'm going to jump. I was like, Eliezer, you just can't do that. So, okay, listen. But I thought to myself, my girls would have never even had the idea to jump. They say, Jerry Seinfeld says, when boys are looking at comics, they're choosing their future jobs. I mean, you'd be Superman or you'd be Batman. It's like this whole, in other words, so it's innately, so it's a challenge. Why is it a challenge? Because a person doesn't want to be embarrassed. I'm going to have to. So the fact that, in fact, it says that our generation, talk about reincarnation. Our generation is a reincarnation of the generation that left Egypt, and we are the nothing to be ashamed of. Right? we're the generation that left Egypt, and we are going to go into Geula. The Rebbe said this very clearly. And the Rebbe was, apart from many other fields, a great Kabbalist. In fact, the Rebbe once on Purim, maybe I drunk a little bit, he went around the table and he said, let's say, what's your name? What's your name? Yeah, Sterner. So based on that, he said, okay, based on Kabbalah, your name is this. Literally, what's your name? Based on Kabbalah, your name is that. So Kabbalah is very, very accurate. So if the Rebbe is saying based on Kabbalah with the last generation, we really are going into Mashiach. But this is very interesting. It's very interesting. Not many people know this. I heard this from my grandfather. So my grandfather had the privilege of being if you want to call it the shliach, the emissary of the Rebbe, to kind of start in a Sheikh Chabad, the Chabad women's movement, Rabbi Yosef Weinberg. So he and his wife, amongst with other women, obviously started in the Sheikh Chabad. So Rebbe said that we know that it's the merit of the righteous Jewish women that Mashiach comes. So therefore, I don't want to mix up two stories. I'm trying to remember. Oh no, I am mixing up two stories. But what I'm saying is also good. This the Rebbe said publicly. The very, very interesting. I'll tell you what the Rebbe said to my grandfather. Fascinating. He said that because we're the reincarnation, it seems like we're not only the reincarnation, but we're kind of the same people. What does that mean? First of all, it says the merit of the righteous Jewish women, our sages, our ancestors left Egypt. What was the merit? Is that they had a munah. I guess the guys had given up hope. They were slaves and it was so bad. They had that's it, we're slaves. But the women always had, and that's why Shira, Miriam, they sang, the Miriam comes from Mar, the Golos was so bitter. Now, why something bitter? When you can taste, I don't know if you know this, Judah Lazarus told me that when are there riots in prison on cake day? Why? Because suddenly you could taste the better reality. So women always knew that it would be better. So in a way, if you know something could be better, you're in a way a little bit more bitter than what it is. Like you see all the time, they're like, we had the cucumbers in Egypt, it was so good. In other words, they were like accepting of the reality. So that's one thing. The Jewish women were very special. But another thing is that the Jewish women, they didn't sin in the Egel Hazahav, right? You have a little background, the lingo, you know what I'm talking about? Yeah, okay. So they didn't sin in the Egel Hazahav. And they also it says they excelled the men with the Mishkan, right? They gave the things. So Hashem gave them a reward in this generation. And I don't know if the men are going to like hearing this, but the reward is that in this generation, their husbands will listen to them. If you know anything about marriage, they say a joke actually, this is a real story. A friend of mine, he went to he was in Boston, a preppy school. So one of the guys there was like, oh, you guys have a very, you have a very like patriarchal religion. He says, so you've never actually been to a Jewish home before, have you? So in our generation, the merit of the righteous Jewish women, and the Rebbe says, and it's the same women. This is what's interesting, because the reincarnation is the same women. The merit of the righteous Jewish women is a mitzvah of tznius, and the Rebbe gets it from Shira Svera, the mitzvah of Shabbos candles. So that's why I think it's such a big mitzvah. Why is it such a big mitzvah? Because nobody wants to look odd or whatever. So we all have a need. Like, I mean, we kind of all dress in the style of our people, right? Like if you see a guy from Saudi Arabia, I'm sure he's dressed with, he doesn't look, people dress in the style. So a person willing to give that up just to do the will of Hashem, that can bring Mashiach. So this is one idea. Now, the other thing that's like that Moshe Rabbeinu. So this is what Moshe Rabbeinu was so impressed with: the idea that we're ready to sacrifice, and we should know. So we shouldn't look down at our generation because we're the generation and the people that really sacrificed a lot for Hashem, a lot, you know. And so even though maybe previous generations they knew more, they may be more religious, and da 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 da, but when it comes to like the internal battle that we face, the ones that really are succeeding in this and the ones that are kind of giving Hashem so much pleasure is our generation. And so, yeah, I don't want to hold anybody. It looks like some people have got to go. Huh? No? You're good? Okay. So the idea is like this, that we have, so now we see that these 5 categories of good and bad. But what we see is that the top category and the very bottom category, which one is very, very, very holy, but the other one is very kind of based on a very internal structure that we want to look good, right? A person by nature, it says, Adam hu medini, a person is a social creature. Nobody wants to feel ostracized. And so therefore we have this kind of complex relationship, which has been set up for us to have this complex relationship. And in a way, it's a good thing. Why? Because imagine if every time you did a mitzvah, that was like, yay, you know. So then you could be doing it for your ego. So a lot of the way the world was set up such a way that you can do a mitzvah, and actually all you'll get is shame. When Mashiach comes, you'll get the pride. But right now, all you'll get is a shame. And I actually have a line, if I can say it, that, you know, the best Jews become Chabad. Why? Because of Chabad, you get no pride. No one's giving you any honor. You know, like maybe some other communities, you come, you know, oh, welcome. Chabad, you know, it's like, okay, how much can you make a contribution? We'll tell you the truth, 100%, but like you do the truth. Nobody's giving you any honor here. So why would you do it? There's only one reason, because you think it's the real thing. So it's a very, very, yeah, that's true. Look, I love Chabad, and I think it's true, this and that. But I'm saying if anybody is becoming Chabad, they're becoming for idealistic reasons, right? There's no, I mean, 90% of people that become religious, I would say, are coming for good reasons. But in the end of the day, it's like there's really no ulterior in this generation. If you're becoming religious, it's in a way it's costing you. You know, if anything, it's more expensive. I mean, obviously it's worth it. It's no question God is true, and religion is infinitely better than being secular and not knowing what to do with you. There's no question about it. But at the same time, it's not like the body is benefiting from this thing, maybe the soul, the spirit, the emotions, but your physical body and your honor and your shame system is not benefiting from this thing.
You
Huh?
know what?
If you're learning, if you're doing all these things,
What do you mean?
if you're learning, you get to the truth of God.
Yeah.
The blood flow. If you're doing all these